What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, Chapter 3 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships, we're going to be looking at what are some desirable psychological traits. We did an introduction to human mating strategies in Chapter 1. Chapter 2, we looked at physical cues of partner quality, and now we're looking at desirable psychological traits. So, the current paper, the title of this, The 3 C's of Psychological Mate Preferences, the psychological traits people want in their romantic and sexual partners. As I said, from the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships. The main author on this paper, Peter Jonassen, is one of the big researchers that has done a lot of research on the dark triad. So sometimes people ask me, like, how do you find papers? What should I look up? If you know that there's an author that has researched a lot about a topic, Peter Jonassen, for example, invented the Dirty Dozen of the dark triad scale. You can go to Google Scholar and look up their Google Scholar profile. It will show you like their H-index, things like that, and all of the papers they did. You can sort that kind of by date. So anyway, if you're interested in research on the dark triad, Peter Jonassen, look him up. He's also got a website, I think. So going on, first slide here, kind of setting the background. Modern relationship patterns, what do we know? Long-term and short-term relationships, right? Long-term relationships, what are those? It's effectively monogamy, serial monogamy in human beings. And there tends to be high expectations of fidelity, commitment, that sort of thing. Short-term relationships, most commonly, as far as short-term relationships in the research, one-night stands. But there's other kinds as well. You know, in a short-term relationship, there's lower or limited expectations for commitment, that kind of a thing. You know, one-night stand, you're not expecting anything aside from sex. Then you have kind of these hybrid styles between the two. A booty call, what is that kind of defined as? Ongoing sex, but maybe the expectations are unclear. There's someone, you know, that's saying, you want to come over for the night and hook up, whatever the case may be, you know, someone that you have on call. Women may want this to transition into a long-term relationship. So as I mentioned in the past, some of these short-term strategies might actually be kind of a springboard into long-term. It doesn't seem as clear that the two are entirely different things or expressions of mating strategies, so to speak. But there's kind of a conflict there, right? Men might not want to. So, you know, there can be kind of a conflict as far as what men are looking for and women are looking for in these relationships. Friends with benefits, another one that's kind of often explored in the research. Friendships, right? People who are friends, but who have sexual activity as well. What do we know broadly across the literature? Women are less oriented towards short-term mating, short-term relationships than men are. Very many robust sex differences, large in size, between men and women on this. And as we mentioned in the previous videos, probably both of them, chapters 1 and 2, traits that are desirable in long-term mates, they also tend to be desirable in short-term mates, even traits that signal long-term partner quality, like we'll talk about that in this video, like kindness or something. They tend to be valued less, but not that much less, okay? So it's not the case that long-term and short-term relationships have like entirely different needs and standards. They overlap a lot. Important to consider that going forward. So, physical attractiveness and the 3 C's. The 3 C's being these things that we can kind of group the psychological traits that are desirable in mates into. Physical attractiveness, we know, highly important, right? No one denies this across all of the research. If anyone says, you know, attractiveness doesn't matter or whatever, well, they're not taking an evolutionary informed approach to human mating. What can be said? Attractiveness, it functions kind of as a bar or a gate. There's a looks test. It has to be met, okay? Standards for physical attractiveness, they have to be met as well before these psychological traits come into play. So there's kind of 2 stages here. Is this person attractive? Do they meet my standards of physical attractiveness? Am I attracted to them? This is kind of what's called like zero acquaintance. Often you don't know the person. So you see attractiveness emerge, for example, very highly in paradigms like speed dating paradigms or an environment like Tinder online, right? Where all you have is physical attractiveness to go on. Boom, that's going to be the thing that kind of determines like, am I interested in getting to know this person a little bit more? If there's no attraction, but you know, these personality things are met, you're probably just going to be friends, right? So it's when this bar of physical attraction is met that we begin to consider these psychological traits. And when they come into play, they are very important as well, right? So the looks test, but that's passed. Now, what else do you have to consider for a short-term mate or a long-term mate? Well, these 3 C's of psychological attractiveness that we find very robustly across the evolutionary literature: competence, compassion, compatibility. We'll go into some details on what those are in the next slides. So, competence, what is it? Okay, we know that there's an evolutionary challenge of raising offspring, both for men and women, by parental care. We've evolved as a very long-term oriented species, slow life history strategy species, okay? Men and women share in biparental care and invest heavily in the offspring, women even more so. So this is a challenge that has to be met, raising offspring. In species where the offspring is not shared or there's low investment from either the mother or the father or one or the other, then that's less of a challenge that must be met. But competence, what is it? An ability as a willingness kind of to raise, take care of children, to invest and all of that. And so we see certain traits associated with competence that are robustly and highly desirable in mates, short and long term, across the literature, particularly when women are assessing men, okay? Intelligence, education, income, creativity, sense of humor. Important to understand, these things all correlate with one another. They all co-vary with each other. So, individuals who are more intelligent, for example, also more likely to have a better sense of humor. These are all things where, okay, if someone has one of these, it's often kind of a signal that they have the other as well. Let's go on now to the next slide. So intelligence and education, given that these are all kind of correlated, we can look at this. Intelligence probably isn't directly selected for. People state a preference for an intelligent mate, but we don't actually estimate it that well in others. So very interesting speed date study, I think by Lars Pinky, I'm sure I said that wrong as well, that looked at this speed dating paradigms. Do people choose an intelligent mate? Intelligence didn't predict who got picked on a speed dating paradigm, but when people picked a partner, when they liked someone, they said, oh yeah, they're probably more intelligent. So we seem to think this is important. We don't necessarily select for it, it seems to be the case, but we probably do select for this indirectly, right? We know, for example, more intelligent individuals much more likely to have long-term relationships, less likely to get divorced, etc., etc. So intelligence correlates with all of these other traits that are attractive and even some physical traits. If you go back to chapter 2, we see, for example, intelligence is correlated with height. IQ and education, highly correlated, right? One of the best predictors of intelligence is level of education. One of the best predictors of how well someone does in school is IQ, etc., etc. So research shows, perhaps unsurprisingly, similar mating preferences for intelligence and education. Mentioned again in the past papers. What do we know about education? One of the more robust status signals across culture, something that is valued very highly in a mate, right? So competence is sort of a catch-all here for what higher intelligence produces. Better life outcomes across the board, higher investment in a mate, better relationship quality, more willingness to take care of offspring and provide, as you know, biparental caregivers, that kind of a thing. So, as I said, we might not actually select for high intelligence, but even given that, what we probably do is avoid low competence or low intelligence. So it might not be the case that we're necessarily shooting for the most intelligent mate, but when we see individuals that signal low intelligence or low competence, we rule them out. It's a hard deal breaker, okay? So what's adaptive? Signals of good genes, provisioning ability, right? Intelligence signals that, and sort of these things that are correlated with intelligence. Even why humor is perhaps an attractive signal, and this is also again consistent with what we know. Women care about this more than men do. So let's go on now to the next slide. Intelligence and relationship type, because we talked at the beginning, right, about how there are kind of different relationship types. They manifest long-term, short-term, okay? So women prefer intelligent men, even in short-term hookups. This is something that's considered. But men, on the other hand, seem to value this only for long-term relationships. Men care less. Why might that be? Again, because women bear a greater burden in short-term relationships. Every short-term relationship, particularly in an ancestral environment before birth control, is potentially a long-term investment. You can get pregnant from that person, then you're stuck with a child, the burden of pregnancy, etc., etc. So short-term mating, again, as we mentioned in the previous chapters, can also be, an evolved function to screen mates as potential long-term partners. So this might be another reason why we see traits that are valuable in long-term partners selected for even in short-term mating contexts, okay? The same is true for all of these other traits that correlate with IQ, for example, humor, as we've been using. What do we know about wealth? Wealth is something that's attractive. Women prefer, rich men over poor men, but the picture's not entirely that clear. For example, men who have earned their intelligence through working, through inventing something, starting a business, whatever the case may be, also are more attractive than men who got their wealth from an inheritance, for example. Why? Because it's not just about immediate resource possession, but also about the ability to acquire them into the future. It's a signal of ability, not just possession of resources. So, important there. Women, they're very inflexible on these preferences for intelligence, okay? So as I mentioned, low intelligence, probably a deal breaker for a lot of women, but that doesn't mean we're selecting necessarily for high intelligence, okay? So what we see here, hypergamous and assortative selections for intelligence, all right? Women show very strong and flexible preferences for men who have a similar level of education or above, right? Women are largely not selecting down, and this is perhaps one of the reasons, highly educated women actually might get fewer matches on Tinder, that kind of a thing. So men even see this and kind of know. We know that people adjust their mating strategies to the environment and to their own mate value, right? People like to shoot up, but they moderate the extent to which they shoot up. So men, perhaps knowing, even on a subconscious level, that a woman is higher status, are not necessarily going to shoot for the higher status woman. Meanwhile, women of higher status, and we know women are getting degrees more and more and more, they might not want to date down. So that gives them a smaller mate pool that they have to kind of draw and compete for in that sense. So the more invested the woman is in a relationship, long-term relationship, right? And also as an individual difference parameter, right? The more a woman is oriented toward long-term relationships, the more all of these things matter. Women with higher mate value as well, not mentioned in this paper, but again in past research, they are also more attuned to all of these different cues, right? So a woman with higher mate value, which often means a woman who's more physically attractive, she's going to care more about all of these things, like is he funny, is he willing to invest, is he committed to me, etc., etc. Not necessarily the case with women of lower mate value, women who are more oriented towards short-term relationships, high sociosexuality, women high in the dark triad, whatever the case may be. Going on now to the next slide, the second C, compassion. What is this? From the evolutionary perspective, kind of the ultimate cause here, or the goal of this, right, is a willingness to invest in the offspring. We talked about ability to invest, right? Like, is he smart enough to make it, basically? But ability is not sufficient, because someone can have the ability, but simply an unwillingness to invest. So you need ability and willingness, a willingness to commit to a relationship, okay? So what does this manifest as far as specific behaviors, psychological traits? Kindness, agreeableness, generosity, altruism, and they mention in this paper, even things like owning a dog can signal like, okay, they're kind of a caregiver type of person. They own pets. They can take care of an animal, so they could take care of offspring. They could take care of me, that kind of thing. Conversely, the hard deal breakers that we see in mate selection, they're very often the inverse of these. They mention in this paper aggression, inattentiveness, untrustworthiness, things that signal this person is not going to be faithful to me, he's not going to commit to me, he might cheat on me, etc. Let's go on now. Next slide. Compassion. Further, what do we know? Kindness. One of the most robust mate preferences for men and women across cultures. A lot of the evolutionary literature has looked at mate preferences, and what emerges at the top very, very often across cultures? Someone who's kind, right? Which, I mean, some people, they say, oh, well, the dark triad is attractive. We can get into that. But kindness emerges as one of the top kind of predictors of mate value, attraction, that kind of a thing. It's highly related to all of these other desirable traits. As we mentioned, there's kind of a co-variability of desire. So individuals who have one desirable trait, a little bit more likely to have others. These things all kind of go together. And this is kind of signals, the tendency to support, commit, help a potential mate. All of these behaviors crucial in long-term relationships. Again, the dominant human mating pattern, not short-term relationships, but long-term relationships, crucial in, taking care of children, biparental care, investment, ensuring that that offspring survives. Also crucial, kind of as a proximal thing, is they keep relationships together. Crucial for pair bonding, crucial for not having a relationship that's a disaster where you think, I cannot stand this person anymore, I gotta leave, okay? And also decreased infidelity, right? So it signals, okay, this is someone who's not gonna cheat on me. Trait agreeableness, assortative, agreeable people pick other agreeable people, selection for all of the big 5 traits, we see assortative mating here, predicts marital stability and a lot of other good relationship outcomes as well. According to this paper, it's considered a highly desirable trait. People like partners who are agreeable. Now, good relationship havers, as I like to call them, they tend to pick other people. That's an assortative mating effect. So we see people that are easy to get along with, and they're happy, and they're affectionate, and they love each other, and they're not super hostile, and they're not throwing the shoe at each other. They're going to pick other people like that. Conversely, people high in disagreeableness, they're going to pick people high in disagreeableness. They're going to have relationships that are very difficult, okay? Generosity and altruism. We mentioned these, both of these, highly attractive traits to women. Why? Why is that? Well, a willingness to invest, as we mentioned, right? But also altruism specifically. an investment, and not just to the mate, but perhaps to others in the community. And it's costly. And there's no reciprocal benefit. It's not a trade-off, like do this for me, quid pro quo, I'll do it for you, right? So why is this attractive? Altruism probably signals good genes, the ability, to invest in a sense beyond oneself without expecting a return on that, and also desirable behavioral and physical traits. It's what's called a costly signal or a hard to fake signal. So an example of altruism, if you're a really good hunter, and there's research from hunter-gatherer communities that looks at altruism kind of as the highest status signal that there can be. I think David Buss said this in one of his videos. He says, in Western societies, people invest in this, but in hunter-gatherer societies, people invest in the bodies of other individuals. And what did he mean? You go out and you hunt an antelope. There's so much meat, you can't eat it all yourself. So what do? You divide it up, you partition it. You just give it freely to the other people that didn't participate in the hunt or whatever, and that gives you high status. Why is that? You're providing for others. There's not necessarily a benefit to yourself, but you're able to do that because you have an abundance of resources, excess resources. This is also true with behavioral traits. It's not just resources. Let me give you an example here. So, the willingness to walk a woman to her car at night. What does that say? I'm willing to take this risk. If, she comes to harm or someone attacks us, I'm willing to defend her. I'm strong enough to do so. I feel competent enough to do so. I'm not afraid, so I'm not a timid little guy. I'm willing to take the risk. So that's something that someone who feels more competent, who's perhaps stronger, who's not as timid would be willing to do. Okay, so that's another kind of altruistic behavior there. Doing something without any expected reward, because doing it is something that is simply within your capacity, very easy for you to do, no skin off of your back to do it. Conversely, what if it's like, oh no, I can't do that. If I walk her to the car, I'm going to get beat up. If we get attacked, I'm going to get killed. So you're signaling that you're like very afraid and that, you're not competent to protect her, etc., okay? Let's go on to the next slide here. Compassion. In short-term relationships, remember, long-term, short-term context. Kindness, it's a little bit less important in short-term relationships than long-term relationships, but still highly important, particularly for women, right? Why might that be? Again, remember, because short-term relationships for women can simply be a springboard into long-term relationships. There's always the possibility that something long-term is going to come from it, so women assess their short-term mates for similar qualities, although the magnitude of the weight they put on those qualities can be different, okay? Warmth, kindness, still valued in short-term relationships, even over status and resources. So think about investment again. I think a lot of people hear investment, they think about like, does he have money? Does he have a good job? Is he going to make a lot of money? But investment is also the time that you spend with a mate, your willingness to take care of her, to be there physically present, to help with childcare, those sorts of things. So we see warmth, kindness here actually more important than status resources, even in short-term relationships, right? There's another reason for this. Why might this be? Well, we know women are very vulnerable. A big danger to women is, in fact, men. Okay, so when women pick a short-term mate, someone they often don't know very well, they have to feel safe. They have to feel safe to have sex. And again, we know that, even as far as like having a good sexual experience, it's really important for women that they feel comfortable and safe with someone. Men are 2 standard deviations stronger than women. Even the average man, 2 standard deviations stronger than 99.9% of women. So women have to feel safe. So, like, oh, he's hot and he's strong and he's big, he could hurt me, but he seems very kind. He's very warm or something like that. Okay, so that kind of balances out. That says, I feel safe with him. I don't think he's going to do something to me when I'm kind of making this leap to have a short-term relationship, so to speak. But physical attractiveness, going back to that, if we rank these, still desired over warmth and kindness in short-term relationships. So short-term relationships, yeah, people put a much higher premium on physical attractiveness. Very, very important for hookups and things like that. What else do we know? Women do have a stronger preference for altruistic long-term relationship, short-term relationships than men do, right? So we expect men to be altruistic in that sense. Men don't necessarily expect that of women, so we see a sex difference here. Altruism in men, more important to women than altruism in women is to men. Women, but not men, they consider kindness as well. An important trait in like booty calls, this is just, going through this chapter, they're talking about different research here. So an example of a sex difference there. Women care about a kind booty call. Men are just like, whatever, she's hot, okay? It's not necessarily the case that men and women prioritize or value physical attractiveness that differently, but men kind of put an almost exclusive focus on it. So men are kind of just like, is she hot? Okay, she passes the test. Women are kind of like, okay, is he hot? But also, does he have all of these other things, right? So higher standards across the board. You got to pass the looks test, but you got to pass all of these personality tests. Women, on the other hand, just kind of have to pass that looks test. So sex and context differences, right? A lot of these things matter more to women, and they matter more in long-term relationships. Let's go on. Next slide. Compatibility, the last of these 3 C's. So what is this compatibility? Interpersonal mate preferences. Basically, who do you get along with? These are much more idiosyncratic, right? Which means who you're compatible with varies a lot more by individuals. These aren't just like universal preferences that everyone has. These depend on who you are, okay? There's a lot of individual differences and individual preferences there. And that does make them harder to study, but still, you can pick individual things like this out and see the correlation and see that there's assortative selection there. Not a problem to do, but you've got to do it kind of on a bunch of individual tiny little things. So they're still very important, and there's many deal breakers in this category, and you can probably think of that. And if you want an example of that, look at our research on dating app deal breakers. Who gets swiped left on? Like people that have the opposite political opinion, right? That's a very limited, narrow thing, but it's like people mate assortatively very highly for political opinions. And if someone thinks you're on the opposite political team, that's enough for them to swipe left, right? That's enough for them to be like, I don't want to be with that guy or girl or whatever. So you have to get along with someone to effectively raise offspring. Compatibility makes a lot of sense. And I think people know this intuitively. It's a part of our folk or pop psychology that, having a compatible partner is important, whatever that means. It allows you to coordinate mating efforts, right? Raise children, that kind of a thing. And it facilitates stronger pair bonding, right? You pair bond more strongly if you have a harmonious relationship, you get along with someone, you have shared things, you talk more, you engage in more activities together. If you have nothing in common and you're always having conflicts because you don't see the world in the same way, that does just chip away at your relationship over time. So highly robust research here on assortative mating. Compatibility, very robustly emerges. And what does that mean? Similarity. We like people who have similar interests to our own, even aside from, similar personality traits, which people also mate assortatively for. Physical attractiveness, which people also mate assortatively for. We know that people have preferences, assortative preferences, for individuals that have similar interests to their own. So think about a practical question here, I guess, for your own dating life. What kind of interests do you have? And how many people, members of the opposite sex that you might be interested in share those? And I think this is a problem a lot of people run into, is that they think about their interests. Like, do your interests suck? Do you do anything that's like exciting to the opposite sex or that you share with them? Is your big interest like playing World of Warcraft? You might have a harder time meeting women than if your interest is like you're a dancer or whatever the case may be. So anyway, yeah. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, right? Think about that question, leave a comment, let me know, do your interests facilitate kind of meeting people, of the opposite sex that you might be interested in that share those kind of interests. So as I mentioned, political beliefs, political ideology, highly assortative and also a big deal breaker, right? Don't need to go too much into that, but yeah, we know as an example, there's kind of that effect there that, someone's on the opposite political team. Often that's just like, nope, right out the gate. They've failed that test. Maybe they passed the looks test, they find out that they vote for Trump or they vote for Biden, and they're just like, nope. Anyway, next slide here. Second one, going into compatibility. There is compatibility beyond interests. Libido or sex drive is one. People have to have kind of a matched libido or sex drive. The level of affection. Some people like a lot of affection in relationships, others don't. And religion also. Religion is kind of like political ideology in that sense, isn't it? That it's like, it can be a big deal breaker. Like, this person shares my values and my beliefs. I want to raise a child in this environment. So these are conscious thoughts as well. These are explicit things, not all of them, because people don't always know if they're selecting someone, like, do they have a compatible sex drive or a level of libido? But some things they do, like, is this person a Catholic, right? So high affection and high sex drive, it's not necessarily the most desirable to all men and women, which I think might be counterintuitive to a lot of men. They might just think like, having a lot of sex is great. Why wouldn't you want someone with a high sex drive? Actually, people tend to show the strongest preferences for individuals who share similar desires in affection and sex. And think about it this way. Do you hate or do you like public displays of affection? Say you're a big PDA person, okay? You like to touch a lot and kiss a lot in public and all of that, and you're with someone who that makes them feel uncomfortable. They think it's embarrassing. They think it's inappropriate. They do not want to show affection in public. They don't want to hold hands or kiss or snuggle or whatever the case may be. So you want to do these things, and that's how you feel loved and all of that. This other person doesn't. And then you're feeling like, wow, I feel kind of loved. And this other person's like, this person's clingy. They're making me feel kind of embarrassed. So you have a conflict there. That's why kind of a match on these things is actually really important. So Once again, we see compatibility more important in long-term relationships than short-term relationships. If you're having a hookup with someone, after last call at the bar, you're drunk or whatever, you're probably not going to ask who they voted for, right? Those things often don't come into play. They do come into play for long-term relationships. But, if they did come into play, you're talking to someone at the bar or whatever, and, it's like a person on the right wing or the left wing, and they find out you're on the opposite side, they might just think like, ooh, I don't like him. He's a member of the opposite tribe, and just call it off. So it's not that they're necessarily completely unimportant for short-term mate selection, but they just often kind of don't come into play. But when people select long-term mates, yeah. So the male desire here for sexual compatibility doesn't seem to shift based on relationship context. This is probably because men have a very high libido relative to women, right? It's called the libido gap. Very big sex differences in sex drive, libido, the amount of sex that men and women want, that kind of a thing. And that also means we see that a low sex drive is much more of a deal breaker for men than it is for women, okay? Women can kind of tolerate that, and probably, because there is that sex difference, men who have a little bit lower a sex drive, they probably match women a little bit more. Men that have a high sex drive, they might just want to have sex like, 2 or 3 times a day or whatever the case may be. Not a lot of women will. But that's kind of what you have there. What else do we know? They mentioned in this paper, okay? There are more kinds of sexual acts in long-term relationships, which kind of shows the effect of compatibility. How can that be? So, people tend to think of like short-term hookups, like the sex is great, it's all about sex, and yet, we know that there's a big orgasm gap. Women are much less likely to have a good experience, less likely to experience an orgasm in a short-term thing, but also people are less likely to kiss, they're less likely to engage in like kinks, or oral or anal sex, all of that. So, kind of these short-term hookups, they're kind of vanilla in that sense. They don't necessarily let kind of that sexual compatibility or, even good sex emerge the same way that it does in long-term relationships. And again, yeah, what else do we know about that? Married people, they have sex more frequently than unmarried people, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, next slide. So previously, right, everything we have talked to up to this point, these are very highly robust mate preferences. Quotation from this paper, and then we're going to go on to the next section, but I thought this was worth cutting out and reading it to you. The why of mate preferences. Only the staunchest science denialist would contest the patterns we have reported above at the level of specific traits desired. For instance, someone who took Plato's allegory of the cave or the movie The Matrix too seriously. Where researchers disagree typically is about why the differences exist. So, the sex difference is very robust. The fact that men and women prefer these things and they're very important, also very robust. Who's denying these kinds of things? I don't know. They say, science denialist, whatever, because we have very robust, replicable things. Anyway, let's go on now. Mate preferences, given that, they said people don't tend to deny that these preferences exist. Instead, what researchers will debate is why. And on the one hand, from social psychology, we have these sociocultural models, right? Which is not the perspective that I kind of take on this channel, and especially, we're looking at evolutionary psychology. Different. But first, sociocultural models. What do they say? These are rooted in early behaviorism, which is basically, the blank slate, the idea that mate preferences are learned, they're imposed by culture or by something like inequality, okay? So you start out as a blank slate. Whatever manifests on that has to do with like what you're taught, how you're raised, what you're exposed to, etc. You have social role theory, okay? And this is that mate preferences are artifacts of socially constructed sex or gender roles. So why do you like women with long hair? Because it's a social role that women have long hair. So you see women with long hair and you think they conform to that social role. You see women with short hair and you think, oh, nope, okay. So it's just these arbitrary roles that somehow appeared, in the world that kind of shape these mate preferences. What about structural powerlessness theory? Mate preferences in this are shaped by inequality, okay? So say there's a desire for resources by women, okay? The idea is like women desire resources in mates more than men do, right? The big sex difference here. Because women have been excluded from resource acquisition. So if women could work and start making a lot of money, women should not care as much, right? Women should not care. I mean, that's kind of not what we see, is it? But that's kind of what that proposes. Social learning theory, Bandura, right? Developmental theory. Cultural norms basically shape everything. Children, they simply start to model everything that they see growing up, which includes expressed preferences. You see a tall, jacked guy that's getting picked by women as a child, and you think like, okay, for a female child, for example, okay, that's what I like too. So it's just kind of modeling and all of that. So Claims of all of these, right, is that there's no or that there's minimum innate mating preferences, which is important with these kind of social constructivist things, right? That none of these mating preferences are innate, they're learned. That's kind of the basis of all of these. And the mechanisms by which they're learned differ depending on each theory, but that's kind of the big underlying premise. On the other hand, for the why of mate preferences, we have evolutionary models. And the sociocultural models, they're very, very popular in social psychology. They're actually pretty bad at explaining a lot of these mate preferences that we see. Evolutionary models, on the other hand, this is that mate preferences reflect traits that would have been adaptive. So, sexual selection on mate preferences, right? Traits that would have benefited natural selection as well, survival, that kind of a thing. They're not necessarily traits that are adaptive today, but they would have been traits that were adaptive across many, many generations of human evolution. So, why are these sociocultural models not great kind of explaining the world? Okay. One thing they don't explain well is how mate preferences are so cross-culturally similar and robust, right? Across, many of these cross-cultural studies in evolutionary psychology, they look at a bunch of different cultures, even hunter-gatherers and all of that. They say, wow, men and women, they kind of like the same things across all of these cultures. We see, in addition to that, that similar patterns of mate choice and preferences, they even occur across non-human animal species, primates, even other animals. So we see similar things, in, I guess, animal societies or whatever that do not even have that kind of culture, right? It's not patriarchy and feminism that made salmon the way that they are or wolves the way that they are. Mate preferences, they also remain largely consistent across age groups and time periods. So sometimes people will say, oh, well, look at the 50s, women had a different body shape then that was more attractive. This is usually very exaggerated. What we actually tend to see across time periods and all of that, most mate preferences, they remain pretty stable, okay? So yeah, probably a better explanation, at least in my opinion, from the evolutionary point of view, is that a lot of these mate preferences are evolved psychological adaptations. Let's go on now to the next slide. More on these evolutionary models, okay? Evolved mate preferences, they are sensitive to context. So some of the times when we see a cultural difference or something, it's not that you're necessarily seeing an entirely different mate preference, but you're seeing the same thing kind of expressed differently in different cultures. So in the West, women like men who have college degrees. In the Maasai culture, women like men with many cattle. But having a degree from Harvard or having a bunch of cows are both big status cues. They're big status signals. So you have a selection for status here, and you also have a selection for competence, right? Selection for intelligence, as we talked about. These evolutionary models of mate preferences, they're very consistent with asymmetries in obligation to offspring, right? Trivers, parental investment theory. So again, what that is, the idea that women have to invest much more in offspring, so women are much more selective, right? Evolution kind of explains that. Quotation here. This is not an emergent reality created by patriarchal power systems, but instead a deep evolutionary pattern that traverses all sexually reproducing genera. So that's something we see. Remember, Trivers' parental investment theory, it applies to all of the animals. The mate that invests more is going to be more selective. And in species where we see the male invest more, we see that they're more selective, okay? Sexual strategies theory, we covered this in chapter 1, 2 videos ago. It's very well supported by long and short-term mating preferences, by the sex differences we see, that kind of a thing. So long-term qualities, short-term partners, still important to women, but a little bit less to men, right? Sociocultural explanations, on the other hand, they make a different prediction. They shouldn't necessarily be that way. In many cases, they should be the same, but we see these sex differences, right, kind of contrary to many of these socioculturally learned hypotheses. Let's go on now. Next slide, life history theory. What is that? This asks the question, how do we allocate effort, time, and resources to our survival versus our mating effort, or to the survival of offspring, right? To raising offspring. So organisms that are more oriented towards somatic life history strategies, which is basically survival of the individual, gathering food, watching your back, that kind of a thing. They tend to invest less heavily, I put more heavily in offspring. Well, they tend to invest actually less heavily in offspring, I believe. Show our life history strategies here. They should have mate preferences like competence and compassion. So you have a slow life history strategy. You invest more in your offspring, right? You're dedicating less effort kind of to the immediate gratification of the self. You're planning ahead. These are features of a slow life history species, right? Or organism. And Species that invest very little in their offspring, on the other hand, they should care primarily about physical traits rather than traits like competence and compassion, right? They're basically looking for good genes. There's no investment, so they're not looking for traits that signal investment. And of course, this is exactly what we see, across animals as well. Human beings, long-term maters, long-term pair bonders, highly invested in raising offspring. The offspring has a very long gestational period, needs help from a mother and a father, that kind of a thing, or even alloparenting, a large kin group to help raise the children. Much more selective. Think of something like a salmon, not very selective. Human beings, in that case, very slow life history strategists compared to many animals. But this can also be applied to individual differences. And it has been, there's some controversy over this, but you have scales that kind of do this. Some people are more oriented toward a fast life history strategy, some towards a slow life history strategy. Some people are very oriented toward long-term relationships, which is more commonly the case. Some people are very oriented toward high investment, toward commitment, others, toward casual sex or something like that. And also to sex differences here, okay? So we know that women invest more in offspring. We've talked about this. So women also tend to care more about these non-physical traits, right? Their bar is higher for selection. They're looking at a lot of things that signal like, is my mate gonna stay, basically. Let's go on now. Last slide here. These are final thoughts on this, just mine. Comparing kind of pop psychology and evolutionary psychology, right? Because I think in this chapter, there's going to be a lot of facts that a lot of people kind of deny in, a lot of dating discourse, pop psychology. So popular dating discourse, these pill communities, red pill, black pill, whatever the case may be. Very common thing people say is like personality doesn't matter at all. So, in these, we have kind of a denial of what are actually very robust, well-replicated psychological mate preferences, okay? On the one hand, evolutionary psychology says these are really important things in mate selection, both in short and long-term relationships. On the other hand, you have, dating gurus and these kind of fringe communities are like, this doesn't matter at all, personality doesn't matter. Well, you can decide which of the two you would like to pick from, evolutionary psychology or podcasters making things up. Overemphasis on physical traits is another thing that we kind of see in pop psychology versus evolutionary psychology. The bar, okay, as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, there's a bar, there's a looks test, right? Physical attractiveness functions as a gate. It's not quite as high as most people seem to think it is. You can look at virginity rates past age 25 and it's like 5% of men, okay? So it's not the case, that some people are completely excluded. Well, I should say it's not the case that most people are completely excluded from mating because of the way they look. Some people are, I'm sure. But it's very few people. Most people can pass that looks test occasionally. And the more attractive you are, the more often you're going to pass it. I mean, this is an obvious given thing. But it's not so high that you have like some super majority of human beings excluded from mating. Not the case in some animals, right? We see some animal species, I think some birds are like this, where you'll have like 2% of the population reproduces, 20% of the population reproduces. Human reproduction, on the other hand, many, many more males actually reproduce. We also see kind of this glorification of dark traits, right? Antisocial personality traits, the dark triad, where they are presented as like, if these are kind of attractive traits and women desire them and all of that. Notice in this paper, none of these dark traits were covered as like robust, attractive traits. Why is that? Because they're not robustly attractive traits, okay? Now, what we do know is that these dark traits, they are in some contexts associated with higher mating success. But why is that? Well, we know that people with these traits behave differently. They're more likely to engage in sexual coercion. They're much less likely to be kind of inhibited and all of that. They have an earlier sexual debut. They're more likely to use drugs, which is, of course, associated with promiscuity, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, you have the behavior of individuals with kind of these personality traits, which functions as a mating strategy for them and facilitates sexual access. On the other hand, you have another question. Are these traits attractive? Which does not necessarily seem to be the case, okay? And again, that's probably why you don't see these kind of things come up in, a chapter of the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology on what traits are attractive. Notice they didn't mention any of these traits, okay? There are kind of, in these pop psychology takes, even in these pill communities, kind of these implicit appeals to sociocultural models over evolutionary models. So if women are picky, for example, it's kind of like the environment made women that way. I mean, no, women evolved to be picky. It's already well explained, Tinder did it or whatever the case may be. There's also often denials of well-replicated sex differences and individual differences, okay? So, kind of like all women just want to have short-term sex with Chad, when actually what we kind of know is that like most women have a really strong orientation toward long-term mating. A lot are not willing to engage in short-term mating at all. that kind of a thing. Anyway, so, going over this paper, some things came up. And so I wanted to say, okay, make a comparison here of what evolutionary psychologists think and what they're presenting and what the research shows versus, what kind of podcasters and gurus tend to say about this and these kind of fringe dating communities, okay? Anyway, that is the last slide. Slides are done. Join the channel, like, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. Join the Patreon, support the project. Next time, we're going to do Chapter 4 of the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. I hope that you guys like Chapter 3, and I will make another video for you very soon.